Welcome to the BEZA Performance Livestream. At BEZA, we do executive disciplines for organizations that want to be world-class. I'm Marshall Henley, the president of BEZA Performance, and today is S&OP Thursday, the second and fourth Thursday of every month, when we get to interview my friend Doug Dedman, president of DBM. We use DBM for all of our S&OP implementations. Welcome, Doug, again.
Oh, good to be here again, Marshall. Always look forward to these.
Yeah, they're kind of fun. So let me remind everybody kind of our fundamentals. We're going to be talking about demand planning and how unconstrained demand and constraints intersect in S&OP, but we want to kind of anchor in the fundamentals of how we view S&OP. So we see S&OP as the president's handle on the business, and it is essentially a strategy link between strategy and execution, I should say. Decisions need to be made as part of S&OP to set the flow rate for the business by family, by constraint-based family in our thinking. And it should be actionable and establish clear accountabilities for those actions. Who owns which demand streams, who owns the supply for each family. And then from a discipline standpoint, it should be regular and repeatable as a management process. The executive should be involved in it, not just in the executive S&OP meeting, but in supporting the execution of the decisions that are made during the executive S&OP meeting. And then finally, the process itself should allow the business to improve, and the process itself should improve as time goes on. You should get better at S&OP the more you do S&OP. So
that's exactly right.
So with that said, today we're going to kind of continue discussing demand streams. We've kind of done two of these on those, and we've gotten to the point where we want to talk about the idea of unconstrained demand and how it intersects constraints for a constraint view of that demand or a shipment plan. As a matter of fact, let me just start there. From a hot topic standpoint, I think most of our clients would say this is right now, especially this is the big deal, right? I've got unconstrained demand. No way we're going to be able to service everyone. So how are we going to do it? Why is that, in your view, such an important topic right now? And
Well, yeah, you kind of hit on it there, Marshall. It's, I mean, you pretty much have to be living under a rock the last,
yeah,
couple of years or be one of those very, very fortunate few companies that I haven't yet run into where they've got more demand than what they have capability to supply. So whether or not it's unable to get resources from a production standpoint, whether it's supply chain issues, which is the one that a lot of people are facing right now. Everybody's kind of in this point that, hey, we've got to deal with, how do we actually constrain our demand, and because we are constrained on the supply side, and ultimately, we've said this several times on this live cast: if you can't build it, you can't sell it, right?
right.
So that's the big thing, and it's a really important topic, and it's especially important when we start thinking about S&OP and those bullet points that you kind of hit off at the beginning of how we look at the executive S&OP process.
So maybe it would be good to. I think you had a graphic you could put up that was from the last time we met, to help people kind of understand how we think of the process in terms of flow of meetings and that kind of stuff. And do we have that we can fire up for
Well,
everybody?
yeah, I thought maybe it might make sense to start a little bit with
Okay.
like we talked a little. That was kind of conceptually, I guess, what
Okay.
how we think about S&OP and constraining,
Right.
but like. So how do those things intersect at kind of a high level? And really, I kind of wanted to make maybe 4 points on this that
Okay.
I will kind of enfold the conversation that we go forward. So I do have a slide, so if you want to pull that up, there you go. So constraining demand in S&OP, what should you really expect to get out of the constraining process, or how should those two things intersect? And I would say in your S&OP process, it should be clear if you need to constrain demand. In other words, we've talked about this, Marshall, many times. It's like,
Yeah.
S&OP doesn't magically fix everything for you, but it sure should make it so that you can't hide from the decisions that you have to make, right? It should be your reality. And so it should be clear if you need to constrain demand. And that should
Yeah.
be out of the S&OP process, and everybody should be in agreement with that.
Yeah.
I would say the second part of that is it should be clear if you've constrained demand in the past, right? So is this an ongoing thing where you constrain demand the last few months? You want to know that, right? Because
Mhm.
when you start to look at your performance as you move forward, right? Sometimes it's really easy to forget where we were a month ago or 2 months ago or 3 months ago. And then we start to question the plans that got put together by the demand side of the organization or the plans that got put together from the supply side of the organization. It's good to know if you've constrained in the past. And this is especially good as you look forward and you start thinking about some of those strategic decisions around
Mhm.
new customer pursuits and all of those sort of things. The third thing on that, the S&OP process should drive to decisions on how you constrain demand, right? Constraining demand doesn't just happen in a vacuum. There are actual activities that you have to do that. That
Right.
if I don't have the product, somebody's not going to get what they want when they want it.
It
And
might be good to make a decision about who that is.
right. And sometimes what's even worse than not getting what they want when they want it is not getting what they want when we promised it to them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
So,
which is a real big issue. I mean, that's probably the biggest distinction between on this particular topic between right now and 3 years ago. We had lots of people with constrained supply 3 years ago, but they had a much better handle on their promise date,
yep.
their customer experience numbers, whatever metric you apply to that
Yep.
PDSL.
The last thing on this, I would say, from an intersection of constraining demand into SNOP is it should show the impact. The SNOP process should show the impact of constraining demand, right? Because if you constrain demand, there's what happens? It potentially increases your backlog, right? And so you need to be able to see that and the results of those decisions. So kind of at a high level, those are the pieces I think about for SNOP, and to kind of dovetail that back to the overarching idea of SNOP. It's about taking control of the business.
Right.
And if you think about those four things that I have up there specifically related to constraining, you know if the process shows those things, that's a big part of controlling this aspect of the business, the
Yes.
constraining aspect.
Good. Yeah, I'm glad you did that. That's a good way to think about it. So, I guess we had talked a bit about this idea of constraining as a process, like there's discrete steps and decisions. Do you have some stuff you could share with folks for that? I think that's the meat that they might be looking for.
Yeah, that's yeah, the okay, that's great, Doug. Great concepts, blah 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 blah. Great. I'll leave and I'll go with those. It's kind of how do you actually get that to happen in
Yeah,
SNOP, right? Like,
right.
like a little bit of the nuts and bolts. And I think this is kind of what
People
you're
and process and tools,
right, exactly. So
structures.
this is probably what you're referring to before, and maybe if you can pull up the screen again, I'll maybe jump through this a little bit. So we and if you don't remember, or if this is all new to you, you can go back. I think those other live streams, Marshall, they're up there. You can
Hmm.
see we talk through this in a bit more detail. But if you look at this particular diagram, real simple, we have this unconstrained view up here. We have a constrained view down here. Your customer lives above the line, you live below the line, right? Customer doesn't care necessarily what your constraints are. They want what they want when they want it. And really, you're trying to figure out how to balance limited resources to make that happen. And so that's where SNOP kind of fits in there. And really, there's three things. I'm only going to show two on this because the third one is so intertwined with these two. And this is slightly different than how I showed it in the past.
Yeah,
But
that's fine.
I reserve the right to change any of my diagrams at any time. So
No
so
problem.
yeah. So the two things I put on here are really process and structure. The third thing is people. How do people interact with the SNOP
Okay.
process,
Yeah.
and how do they interact with the structure? And so when we're thinking about constraining and we think about the process, right? You can look at that and go, okay, so this is a fairly standard. If you've read any S&OP books,
Yeah.
people will ask the question, oh, why do we have to have all these meetings? Well, there's a specific reason for a couple of these meetings, and they actually dovetail very nicely into this discussion of constrained versus
Hmm.
unconstrained. Because the first part of that meeting is the arrival at the S&OP, the demand plan. And you can think about that demand plan as the collection or the culmination of all your other demand planning activities to develop a totally unconstrained demand plan, right?
That's your
And this
chance
is
to really ask, what if we could meet
what,
the, yeah.
yep, yep. It's that external market facing view versus the internal. Now, operations can be part of that discussion, but I can tell you there's been many times where I've sat in those demand meetings and they get taken over by the operations side of the
Right.
business. And typically, what I see in that case is it's almost like you've led the witness, if you will, right?
Yeah.
We've already started constraining, before we kind of figured out what does the demand look like. And so this is really the output of that is the unconstrained demand plan. And you're going to see it in a minute that that's got to be two pieces. One is bookings and the other one is shipments. And it is the ownership of sales or sales and marketing to get that done. And also to highlight as part of that process, what are their major assumptions in those demand plans? Because everything going forward is always driven off of a series of assumptions. This is what we think is going to happen.
Yeah.
It's those assumptions that really, are undergirding the plan. That's all going to be part of this.
And just to make sure we're homogenous with everybody in terms of their own internal terminology, bookings is the sale. It might be POs. It might be what you expect for POs. It can be forecast too, but it's essentially the what you're going to take in orders, and then shipments would be the unconstrained plan for when you're going to deliver those before you
Yep.
pass it through the. Okay.
Yep. So
So
think
what we
about
call
it as
shipments, some people call sales. I just want to be careful with that,
right.
right?
Yeah, I like to think about it as, kind of from more of a product based manufacturing background.
Yeah.
It's the orders, the bookings are order inflow, and the shipments are really order outflow or product outflow, right? And yet,
Yeah.
you need to have those orders coming in, and product outflow being the shipments.
So
Yeah,
I think from a racy standpoint, we can say maybe you don't want to cover this, but that you can own as the sales team or the people who are responsible for getting orders can own both of those. They don't need the supply people to sign off because we're talking about the unconstrained view of the
right.
world. Okay.
Yep. Yep. And really, the process from the demand meeting then going down to the supply meeting, right? This is where I have to deal. I'm below the line. I'm dealing with my internal reality, whether that's inventory constraints, whether that's production constraints, supply chain constraints. I'm now dealing with the what can I do? This
Yeah.
is what could I do? This is what can I do? And then here in this pre S&OP meeting is really where I deal with the constraint that came out of this operations meeting,
Hmm.
right? And these are some of those tough decisions of what is the impact of that constraint and how do I see that? And this is where it becomes very important that I do have both of those aspects of demand, both bookings and shipments.
So one of
Yep.
the
Go
things
ahead.
that we oh sorry, one of the things we kind of led with when we published this on LinkedIn and YouTube was that if you kind of ignore those two steps, you do so at your peril. And we run into a ton of companies with S&OP intact where they kind of blow through that, and you really don't see the unconstrained view get much view. It's like that's to your point. It sort of gets swamped immediately in the flow of the process. This gives us a discrete pause between an unconstrained view of the world before we do have to look at the constraints. That's not a problem, but we have a place there to ask how. I mean, ideally, we would say how can we meet the unconstrained view and execute it as it is presented.
Yeah, it's I think it's if I really think through that, and as we've talked about this many times, right? Is I've got to be able to see both things, right? I've got to be able to see. I've got to move through it. I've got to be real clear on where I'm at, and
Yeah.
that actually comes back to the second part of this, which is really that structure, right?
Right.
And I put these two things together just because.
Well, but I bumped you off of executive S&OP. Did you want to finish there before you, or are we
Oh, on
good?
the executive S&OP
Yeah.
meeting? Yeah. Yeah, I just in terms of thinking through, like, coming to those executive meetings and not really actually addressing the idea of it being constrained, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this goes to that question of how can I tell it needs to be constrained? And I mean, you've asked me several times, hey, how the heck can they be coming into their exec meeting and their production's way above their capability, or their inventory is all negative? Like, who missed the boat on this? And
Yeah.
part of that is in this process, and it does dovetail into the data a little bit, is because when you look at S&OP, it's the culmination of a whole bunch of other planning activities that you do. It's the management process of that. It happens
Yeah.
monthly, and the reason it happens monthly is because you can't do all this stuff all the time.
Right.
But what you're really trying to do is look back at what happened and look at all the work you've done to prepare your demand plan to say, hey, what does this look like when I aggregate that up? And what does that look like at the family level? And what
Yeah.
does that mean? And does it really get us to where we're planning on going? And so part of the challenge when we get to the executive S&OP meeting, we see some of those disconnects. It's because other parts of the planning process are often broken. In other words, we're not doing a good job of managing our past due backlog. We're not, and that is also something that should be very obvious in the meeting. And I would say
Hmm.
on many of the S&OP journeys that we go through, that's a big chunk of them in the first year, is getting those aha moments around
Yeah.
data that says, "Oh crap, I'm
You
looking
can't
at
have a
this,
negative inventory plan for the next 12 months like that. That
doesn't
can't keep
work."
showing up every month. That's not a plan. That's a
Right. That's not a plan. We can't.
antimatter
So,
plan or
so
something.
yeah. So that's a big thing. Just to quickly put this through on the data side of things, and I would just encourage anybody. I'm not
Hmm.
going to spend a lot of time on this here, but one of the big things for us is, in order to think about constraining, it means your S&OP families need to be by constraint. They need to be defined below the line here,
Hmm.
because this is, when I start to get into those decisions around how am I going to allocate scarce resources, be that my people, be that money around inventory, investment in machines. My families are related to the constraints, and then I use demand streams to look at this above the line. And those demand streams are some consolidation of a level of customers. I'm going to show you that in a minute.
So
Um,
the above the line is how do we face the market? That's the model, and that's where the
yep.
demand streams. That's the objects in that model that are being used. And then on below the line, we're looking at not like theory of constraints, but macro constraints like value streams or lines in plants, and I mean products that are product categories, even. I mean that kind of stuff.
So it may make sense, Marshall, if I'm just going to flip over to an actual S&OP
Okay,
sheet here,
yeah,
if
that's
that
great.
makes sense, and then we can pull it up and look at it. So um, I'm just going to. This is actually taken from a customer that we've been working with back as of their April S&OP, but I think it'll probably describe a little bit of what we're looking for. So we talked about the 5 section sheet in the past.
Hmm.
Marshall, you mentioned when I think about demand, I've really got the bookings aspect, which is order inflow. I've got my shipments, which is order outflow, and I've got my backlog, which really comes in two pieces. One is kind of the age backlog, when I have orders for, and then I
Right
have
on.
my
Yeah.
total backlog. Down here, I have my production, my supply plan, and then down here I have inventory.
Just to be
So
clear on the aged backlog, I know some folks, if you don't use it, that's the current month plan backlog spread out over the next. however many months you're spreading it.
Right. The easiest way to think about that is take all of your open orders and put them in the month in which you've actually promised them to be shipped. And we use promise date because if you think about the S&OP process and taking control of the business, right? Promise date I control,
Yeah.
right? I can't control the request date from my customer.
Right.
And I get in some interesting arguments about that.
We
You've got to
recommend you track both, right? But not
right.
necessarily. Yeah.
You track both, but you have to fix your promise date service levels before you fix your request date service levels.
Right.
Right. And a lot of people get that wrong.
Yeah.
Right. And it is part of the role of those demand streams, because if I've got a group of customers that I have a certain amount of lead time for, right, I might do a better job of establishing their promise dates versus ones that have maybe a shorter lead time that I've got in a group. And so it is one of those things that when you start to put those metrics together, kind of important to how you look at that. But if
So
you look at, oh, go ahead.
okay.
Yep.
I was just saying, walk us through the constraining, the
Yeah.
unconstrained to constraining view logic here. I think that'd be I think that's what this is for. And I think that'll be
Yeah, absolutely.
helpful.
You'll have to excuse me because I might be looking over to the left while I'm talking a little bit.
Sure.
So it's not that I'm just gazing off into
Right.
the sunset. My screen's over there. So, um, so if you look at it, I've got my booking plan and I've got my shipment plan, and right now those are both, I'm going to call them unconstrained. And if I did a shipment drill down on that, you would actually see I've got 4 demand streams that make that up. And
Hmm.
one is all other customers. And then down here, you can see I've got really 3 large customers. And you can see I'm actually tracking the actual shipments compared to the plan for each month. I have the backlog for that customer. And I also have the forward-looking plan and a comparison to the last plan. You can
Okay.
see right now we did not constrain our plan last month, and we haven't constrained it yet this month. So how did I know I needed to constrain? If I go back to the 5-section sheet here, I know because I have this negative inventory number.
Hmm.
I can see this graphically as well by looking at my inventory line and seeing that it is below the negative, right? So I've got a problem. You can see I've got a backlog profile based on my bookings and my shipments. By the
Hmm.
way, in this case, we have sales forecasting the shipments, and we're using lead time offsets for the customers to calculate what does that turn into in booking. So in other words, if the customer has a 3-month lead time, whatever we plan to ship in 3 months, we would expect to be booking that in this current month. If that makes sense,
Yeah.
right? So what I'm going to do is, if I go back to the 5-section sheet, I'm actually going to go to the demand input here, and I'm going to pull up my constraining demand stream. So in this case, in our current tool set, the way that we use it right now, I'm actually going to just enter a single constraint here. And by the way, just to make this really easy, I went ahead and figured it out before we got in here, because I didn't want to run through the math with everybody as I was working on that. So I'm just going to copy this over from another spreadsheet I have here. Hopefully this works. Nope. Clearly a user error.
Always a glitch.
Let me try that one more time.
It's usually, yeah.
Yeah. There we go. So I don't know if you can see those numbers very
Hmm.
easily, but I basically have constrained the first month by about 9,700 units. If you go to the 5-section sheet, you can see that I had a negative 96.
Yep.
So I knew that's what I want. Now, this negative number is cumulative as you go forward. So I went ahead and figured out, okay, so this is what I need to do. I'm going to take some out of the first month, out of the third and the fourth month, and I'm
Hmm.
going to put it back in. The goal being that when I constrain, I want the sum of the constraints to be 0. I'm basically almost peanut buttering my demand a little
Yeah.
bit, going forward. I'm going to enter that.
I mean, those are the constraints in your supply chain. You can't. you can't make the math better. You can just move where the numbers go by month based on
Right.
what you're going to be able to
Right.
produce.
And there might be some room if you look at this. I might have been able
Hmm.
to play a little bit with my production because I'm under my capability. But if you look
Yeah,
at this first part of the plan, this is really frozen based on their supply chain lead time. So
yeah,
everything here is dependent on incoming
parts.
components that are, yeah,
Yeah.
and then this is really frozen. Their supply chain actually goes out as far as January, so we're sitting here in April. They're a good 10 months of supply chain lead time.
Hmm.
So when you're looking at that, I have some flexibility out of here, but I'm already within my lead time. So I could have maybe played with that, and I might have some room out here. But I can tell you, we've been spending a lot of time with them just in trying to get a good view of the plan based on what the supply chain constraints are. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to reload this same 5 section sheet, and you're going to see the difference of me putting in that constraint. So as I said, I kind of figured it out ahead of time
Yeah.
to run me as close to zero inventory as possible.
And those decisions would be made in the supply and the pre S&OP meetings, basically.
Well, yeah, and ideally, you're kind of coming to the pre S&OP meeting with a proposal, not
Yeah,
necessarily figuring that all out in there. Because if you
yeah.
think about it, large organization, it might have 7 or 8 people in the room. That discussion, I mean, in some places, that is the discussion, right?
So the first view where we had negative inventory, that might be what you end up with at the beginning of the supply meeting. By the end of the supply meeting would be kind of ideally where you're going with this as a
Right.
proposal to take into the pre S&OP meeting, and then hash out eventually, and we'll get to this, where which demand streams are going to be affected by the constraints.
Right, perfect. Because if I look at it, right, so I've now constrained this. So if we look at the graphical 5 section sheet,
Yeah,
right, you can see I no longer have that negative inventory. I got inventory climbing up here, but I'm not too worried about this yet, right?
yeah.
We're missing part of if you look, our demand plan's coming down, and that is something they're grappling with is how do we extend
Their
this
bookings
demand?
is sunsetting with their fiscal year instead of
Yeah, absolutely.
continuing on a rolling 12, which we would not recommend either. But it
Yep.
is what it is.
But if you remember what this backlog profile looked like, it kind of went up and then it went down. Well, now we're
Hmm.
having a situation where we're holding more backlog
Right.
as we go. So the first question is, when you constrain, where does the difference go? Well, the difference goes to
Yeah, it's not
backlog.
just a spreadsheet. There's somebody that's gonna somebody's
Yeah.
getting affected.
Yeah. Well, so the first part is in aggregate, it goes to my backlog. So if you look
Yeah,
at it, if I'm shipping somewhere out here, I'm getting close to 20,000. In June, I'm really sitting on about 5 months of backlog,
right.
right? So we constrained shipments, we kept bookings on the unconstrained, and now what we've got is this difference showing up in backlog. Now, that obviously introduces a risk to the business, right? Because
Hmm.
as lead times stretch out, it might mean someone can't is or is not, they're going to maybe go to someone else, right? A
Yeah,
competitor. Everybody
that's why
right
there's a pre
now.
S&OP meeting, because that's where that gets flushed.
Right, exactly. And those are some of the things that go into the strategic decisions about who do we ship to, right?
Yeah,
So going to where you were talking about is if I do that shipment drill down again, you can see I've now got this where I've constrained really in the first 4 months. I've actually constrained my plan by about 32,000 units. That
yeah.
means in this period of time, one of these 4 demand buckets is not going to get everything that they want.
So what's forcing we're being forced to answer at least two questions. The first is who's being affected by the constraint, which clients, which
Yep.
demand streams, which clients within which demand streams, that kind of stuff. Um, and then the second I get the question, I guess, that we might answer separate from that would be, do we even want to do this? Should we actually just stop taking orders from people if we can't deliver them within a reasonable period of time? And then a third question would be, how do we fix the supply side? But you're not going to do that overnight. And that's often
Right.
why BEZA and DBM work together initially. I would be brought in. We would do bottleneck breaking and increase capacity by 30% in 6 months or something. But the reason they knew they needed to do that is they saw the big lump in the snake coming down in their bookings, and they knew that they weren't going to be able to digest that without increasing their supply chain capacity, and somehow that had to get done. And it was a non-trivial thing to do, but they had an intact working S&OP process that was constraining as part of the plans, constraining their shipments. And
Yep.
to me, that's pretty critical. What we haven't talked about is the basis for how you decide those, because that's the story of the business that you got to figure out on your own. And everybody's got different ways of thinking about that. One of the ways that I think is a great way to kind of make some decisions, to provide some intel on those types of decisions, is to use what we call as a net landed profit analytics. So we take a look at the actual net landed profit by SKU and by customer SKU and by color, and we just look at contributions of profit at a very micro level to kind of pinpoint some actions we could take in the short term to maybe use profit impact as part of our decision matrix in terms of the risk we have in extending lead times or any of that stuff. Watch next week on the 31st. We've got a live stream with Richard Sharp on net landed profit analytics, but just a little plug for next week. But
Yep.
in the meantime, I think what we're seeing here is clearly the reality we're talking about in the first four principles. Like you have to address the reality and make the decisions that this is calling for.
Yeah, and I agree totally with your comments that there's always it's a very emotional decision when you're going to put somebody on allocation, right? But it also needs to be a business decision.
Yeah.
And you get five different people in the room, and you'll have five different you know arguments as to who it should be. One of the big things to start to look at is, do you have a customer that's got like lumpy demand? And if
Right.
you're supplying to an OEM who's got a production line that your product goes into, and you see that kind of lumpy demand, that's usually an opportunity to work through some demand smoothing, to buy
Yeah.
yourself some capability, because it just might be their buying patterns. And so it goes back to that whole thing about those demand streams, is sometimes we get so down into the weeds thinking customer by
Right.
customer by customer, that if you kind of think about this, I mean, the example I had really, three large customers and all other, but you might be looking at your OEMs, you might be looking at your distributors, and then you might be looking at, your small customers. And then you overlay on top of that profitability on that. And I mean, ultimately, it's things like, what alternatives do they have? Is it a captive market for us, right? Those
Yeah.
are the kind of things that you want to at least be seeing. And it's really driven us. The tool that I'm showing right now is we're working through a lot of that constraining process to improve that piece of the tool,
Yeah.
because
To
we're,
force you
we're
to make the
well,
decisions.
right, and we're 2 years into three, at least 2 years into this,
Yeah.
and it's changed my thought process on
And
how important that is.
to be clear, when you say we're into this, we're talking specifically about constraining
Yes.
logic, and
Yeah.
how do you flush that back into the demand stream? How do you go back above the line and say, okay, which of these unconstrained demand streams are now going to have to be constrained, and who within them is going to be
Right.
constrained?
The worst thing that can happen to you is you have a demand meeting, or sorry, you have the S&OP meeting. The day after that, you get three sales guys calling to the operations and saying, I need you to do this, right? This customer's on the phone, because it's the one that's on the phone, right? At that time, that's the most important one. And it's tough to say no. I mean, yep, I've been there, right? It's tough to say no to that customer.
Right.
And that has to be a strategic decision, or you're going to get the points where you're basically kind of bouncing against each other and
Yeah.
not getting there. So hopefully that answered those questions on,
Yeah.
it should be clear if you need to constrain demand. It should be clear if you've constrained demand in the past. It should be really clear on what decisions you have to make on how you're going to constrain the demand. And
Right.
then it really should be clear what the impact of that constraining is. So,
Who is going to be constrained?
yes,
Maybe.
we're really is, yeah. Who is it going to be constrained? And I mean, ultimately, you start constraining a lot.
Yeah.
And what starts to become obvious if you hold that bookings plan as to where sales thinks it could be at some point in time, and we saw this in the S&OP meeting this morning. They are at risk with some customers because lead times just keep pushing out, and
Yeah.
so
And they're
it is how
getting
do we
better.
right. So now we've really got to manage that as we go through. So hopefully that was helpful to go through a pretty complex topic in this time. I mean, I'm always
Yeah.
if people have questions, feel free to email me or get a hold of
Well,
Marshall.
we're,
Yeah.
we're kind of out of time, but let's consider continuing this conversation, maybe doing some more examples and specifically getting into some of the more advanced constraining logic by demand stream, because that's where we've been, folks, is we've been talking about how your demand streams model your unconstrained demand and it flows into the S&OP process. Now we looked at how to constrain by family that stuff, but we haven't looked at how to flush that back to the demand stream. So if
Yep.
Doug's up for it, we can maybe do that next time.
I'm always up to talk about any topic on S&OP. You know that, Marshall. So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks again, folks, for joining us again on S&OP Thursday, the second and fourth Thursday of every month. The next one will be June. I can't remember off the top of my head, but you can probably figure out what the second Thursday in June is, and we'll continue with talking about demand streams and how they intersect with a good S&OP process. Thanks again, Doug. Thanks for watching, folks. See you next time.
I know.